In the winter of 1981, deep inside a reinforced command bunker near Sverdlovsk, a Soviet air defense colonel slammed his fist onto a polished oak table and used one word to end the briefing: supremacy. Not advantage, not potential, supremacy. The document in front of him described the MiG-25 interceptor as a weapon that would dominate the upper sky, a machine built to decide wars before enemy bombers ever saw Soviet borders. They didn't just believe it worked, they believed it was inevitable. The Foxbat was born out of fear in the late 1950s, when intelligence whispers spoke of an American ghost aircraft called the XB-70, a silver spear meant to fly higher and faster than anything that had ever existed. And so Soviet engineers under Mikhail Gurev's successor designed a brutal answer, an aircraft that sacrificed elegance, agility, and endurance for raw speed and altitude, powered by two monstrous R-15 engines that drank fuel like fire and scorched the air so badly ground crews wore heat-resistant suits during engine tests. When the American bomber project quietly died in Washington in 1961, no celebration echoed in Moscow, because planners there were convinced the Americans would simply build something worse, something faster, something unseen. And so the MiG-25 entered frontline service anyway, at bases stretching from the Baltic to the Far East, a guardian waiting for a threat that never came. Then, in September 1976, everything cracked open when Captain Alexei Morozov, flying a routine patrol over the Sea of Okhotsk, diverted south and landed his Foxbat on foreign soil, delivering Western analysts a shock they hadn't expected. The aircraft wasn't a miracle, it was a compromise. A steel airframe welded instead of milled, electronics glowing with vacuum tubes instead of silicon, and a radar set that could spot large, clean targets far away, but struggled badly against anything small, low, or clever. The polite assessment written later in Washington said the interceptor was optimized for a vanished battlefield, a careful phrase that masked a harsher truth. The Soviets had built a colossal answer to an enemy that no longer existed. And yet, the Foxbat was never meant to fight alone or think for itself, because Soviet doctrine assumed the sky would be choreographed from the ground, that radar stations would see first, command posts would decide first, and the pilot would simply obey. Sprinting to altitude, launching massive R-40 missiles from extreme range, and fleeing before escort fighters could react. It was fast, brutally fast, and against slow, predictable bombers flying straight lines, it might have been lethal. But history was already bending against it, because while Soviet engineers doubled down on speed, American engineers were quietly solving an entirely different problem, one that would soon turn the Foxbat from hunter into target, and that collision was already forming beyond the northern seas, waiting for the moment when the MiG-25 would finally meet an enemy it was never designed to see coming. What surfaced later through fragments shared by Scandinavian analysts and one tightly controlled debrief of a former radar officer was not confusion, but fear, because Soviet Air Defense Command understood something was fundamentally wrong. Their crown jewel interceptor was being watched, calmly and invisibly, long before it could see anything at all. The alarm didn't come with sirens or emergency orders. It crept in through after-action notes and cockpit recordings that didn't quite add up. Major Sergei Levin flew 43 intercept sorties between 1980 and late 1982 with the 182nd Guards Regiment stationed outside Olenegorsk, operating the MiG-25 PDM, the so-called modernized Foxbat with revised warning systems and updated R-40RD missiles, upgraded on paper but still chained to the same radar philosophy. On November 22, 1982, at 13:58 local time, Levin was launched on what looked like another routine shadowing mission over the Barents approaches. Ground control reporting a single unknown contact drifting northeast, altitude 34,000 feet, speed steady and unthreatening, likely a NATO intelligence aircraft probing the perimeter. Levin followed the checklist almost on muscle memory alone, climbing hard, leveling above 40,000, pushing the throttles until the engine screamed, trusting the ground controllers to do the seeing for him. At 14:05, with the reported range still well beyond 150 kilometers, his radar remained silent, waiting for the final cue. Then the cockpit changed character in an instant. The Berioza warning panel flared alive, not with the lazy pulse of a search radar, but with the solid, unmistakable tone of fire control. A sound pilots were trained to associate with the final seconds before a missile launch. Direction indicator forward left, perfectly aligned with the supposed target track. Levin checked the range again in disbelief, because no Western fighter radar should have been able to lock him at that distance, not against a high-altitude, fast-moving interceptor, not without him seeing something in return. Ground control insisted the contact was still far, still passive, still harmless, yet the warning tone did not fade. It held steady, calm, confident, as if someone out there had already made a decision. For the first time in his career, Levin felt exposed rather than powerful, flying a machine built to ambush bombers while being calmly examined by an unseen opponent. He throttled back instinctively, broke slightly off vector, and the tone softened just enough to tell him the truth no briefing had ever admitted. The Foxbat was no longer the hunter at the edge of the sky. It was the loudest, brightest thing up there. And somewhere beyond the horizon, someone was tracking him deliberately, effortlessly, waiting. A realization that would ripple through Soviet doctrine and force commanders to confront an impossible question that leads directly into what happened next. What do you do when your fastest interceptor can no longer hide? The numbers alone told Captain Andrei Volkov that something impossible was happening, because every exercise he had ever flown against NATO Phantoms ended with contact appearing inside 60 kilometers at best. Yet now the threat warning in his cockpit had been screaming since a distance where Soviet doctrine said the sky should still be empty. His post-flight notes, briefly referenced in a mid-1990s aerospace journal before the article vanished without explanation, describe a moment of genuine disbelief as he asked ground control to identify the aircraft and received a flat, almost embarrassed response. Type unknown. Continue intercept. The warning tone never wavered as the range collapsed in steady mechanical steps, 150, 140, 130 kilometers, while his own radar remained silent by doctrine, waiting for a phase of the fight that clearly was not coming. When Volkov finally powered up the RP-25 at long range, the scope bloomed with useless noise from the jagged Norwegian coastline, reflections and clutter swallowing anything smaller than a bomber, and the realization hit him with physical force. Someone had a firing solution on him, and he was blind. Ground control repeated the bearing like a prayer, insisting the contact was ahead, while Volkov felt the balance of the engagement slipping away second by second. At 100 kilometers, he requested permission to break off, citing unknown radar illumination, and the denial came instantly, protocol overriding instinct. He waited 20 more kilometers, then made a decision that would never appear in an official report, rolling the Foxbat into a hard turn south, diving for terrain, trading altitude for survival. The warning tone died abruptly as mountains rose between him and the unseen watcher, and Volkov landed shaken, never having seen the aircraft that had owned his sky. Across the sea, Lieutenant Mark Ellis of the 495th Tactical Fighter Squadron out of RAF Lakenheath remembered the same encounter from the opposite side, because for him it felt less like a fight and more like an experiment already solved. On his second month flying the F-15A over the northern approaches, AWACS painted a single fast mover at high altitude, a textbook Foxbat profile, and Ellis's radar acquired it so far out, the range numbers looked wrong, a clean, stable track forming at over 200 kilometers. His wingman confirmed without hesitation. The APG-63 sorted the target effortlessly from the background, velocity and altitude separating it from the Earth like a flare in darkness. And when Ellis commanded a lock, the system responded instantly, steady and calm. He knew the Soviet pilot would be hearing the warning now, knew the psychology because American training emphasized exactly this moment. Make the opponent feel seen. As the distance closed, Ellis watched the track hesitate, then bend sharply south, the altitude dropping as the Foxbat fled toward safety. There was no missile shot, no merge, no drama, just a quiet acknowledgement in the cockpit that the game had changed. The old rules assumed speed was protection, altitude was sanctuary, and ground control was omniscient. But out there over cold water and empty sky, those assumptions died without a single round fired, setting the stage for a doctrinal reckoning that would unfold not in dogfights or headlines, but in classified meetings where Soviet commanders had to confront an unbearable truth. Their interceptor could no longer surprise anyone, and the sky they thought they dominated was already being watched. By early 1983, the pattern was impossible to ignore, and even pilots who avoided speculation started trading glances after debriefs, because whatever was happening in the northern air corridors no longer looked like routine Cold War choreography. Lieutenant Colonel James Harlan, who took over intelligence liaison duties at Lakenheath that winter, later described it as watching confidence drain out of the other side in real time, because the Soviet interceptors weren't just turning away. They were reacting emotionally to something they didn't understand. AWACS tapes showed it clearly. Approach, lock indication, abrupt maneuver, descent, disappearance. Not curiosity. Evasion. Harlan's analysts mapped the timelines and realized the disengagements almost perfectly coincided with the moment F-15 radars entered full-track mode, long before any visual contact or radio challenge. On the Soviet side, fragments from post-Soviet memoirs and selectively released documents suggest the realization hit like a shockwave, because the entire logic of air defense relied on a single assumption: see first, decide first, shoot first. Once that collapsed, everything downstream collapsed with it. Interceptors designed to sprint blindly toward ground-controlled vectors were suddenly glowing targets, their speed and altitude no longer protection but a signature, something that screamed their presence across hundreds of kilometers. Pilots began reporting what they described as being lit from nowhere, locked without warning, with no corresponding return on their own scopes, a sensation that felt less like combat and more like exposure. Commanders quietly adjusted rules of engagement, authorizing earlier disengagements, more conservative profiles, fewer aggressive pushes toward NATO airspace. And these adjustments filtered down not as explanations but as vague cautions, eroding trust between pilots and controllers. Meanwhile, American crews understood exactly what was happening, even if they weren't allowed to say it out loud. The F-15 wasn't just faster or more agile. It had inverted the engagement entirely, turning detection itself into a weapon, forcing the opponent to react before the fight even began. No missiles were fired because none were needed. The radar lock alone was enough to dictate behavior, to bend Soviet flight paths away from the gap, to rewrite the geometry of the air war without a single explosion. By the time spring came, Foxbat sorties over the Norwegian Sea thinned noticeably, and when they did appear, they stayed farther out, higher caution baked into every maneuver. The shift never made headlines, never triggered alerts, never appeared in speeches, but it marked a quiet turning point, because in that empty sky over cold water the Soviets learned something devastating. Supremacy wasn't about speed or altitude anymore. It was about information, and they no longer controlled it. Before that winter, everything in the northern sky followed a script so reliable, NATO planners could set their watches by it, because Soviet intercept behavior had been conditioned by decades of centralized control and technological confidence. Colonel Pavel Sidorin, who commanded a radar sector outside Kandalaksha in the late 1970s, later described it as choreography rather than combat. Ground stations detected first, controllers calculated geometry, fighters were launched on rails of radio commands, and pilots acted as extensions of the system rather than independent actors. MiG-25 crews pushed straight toward the vector, fast and high, trusting that the unseen network behind them understood the air picture better than they ever could from a vibrating cockpit. Even when confronted by NATO fighters, the Foxbats rarely flinched, maintaining altitude and heading until the last practical moment, turning away only after the mission objective had been met or fuel margins demanded it. That predictability, vanished almost overnight. Starting in late 1982 and accelerating through 1983, Norwegian and British analysts noticed Soviet intercept profiles becoming erratic, cautious, almost defensive, with pilots reacting not to visual contact or missile launches but to something internal, something invisible to observers until patterns emerged. The SPO-15 warning receiver had quietly become the most important instrument in the MiG-25 cockpit, overriding ground instructions, overriding habit, overriding ideology, because it was the only thing telling the pilot a truth the rest of the system could not confirm. When it lit up at impossible ranges, it forced a choice that Soviet doctrine had never prepared them to make. Trust the machine screaming in your headset, or trust the calm voice on the radio insisting everything was under control. By granting pilots the authority to disengage based solely on that warning, Air Defense Command effectively admitted that the ground-based system no longer owned the first move. Control fractured upward, from centralized certainty to individual survival instinct, and once that happened, the psychological balance of the intercept mission broke apart. American pilots noticed the change immediately, not as a dramatic confrontation but as absence, as targets that refused to play their assigned role, turning away early, diving into clutter, denying the encounter altogether. No dogfights were lost because none were fought. The victory was informational and emotional, achieved before visual range, before weapons, before history would normally mark the moment. And that is why the MiG-25 story doesn't end with a shoot-down or a famous battle, but with stress fractures in a tail section, silent radar scopes, and pilots who learned, alone in the cockpit, that the sky they were trained to dominate no longer belonged to them. What changed after that was not just tactics but silence, the kind that settles when an institution realizes it has learned something it cannot easily explain upward or fix downward. Before, intercepts were performances with rules, distance, timing, professionalism, a mutual understanding that everyone would go home intact. After late 1982, the sky became nervous. MiG-25s no longer flew like instruments of a system. They flew like individual aircraft piloted by men making survival calculations in real time. Norwegian radar logs show it plainly. Intercept geometry collapsing early, approach vectors abandoned, foxbats peeling away at distances that made no sense under old doctrine, ground controllers transmitting more, faster, repeating instructions that pilots increasingly ignored. Whatever confidence Soviet air defense once projected dissolved into fractured behavior, and NATO analysts eventually stopped calling it an exercise because exercises don't generate fear. When Captain Alexei Moren crossed into Norwegian territory in August 1983, carrying maintenance binders and handwritten notes from his regiment, the pieces finally aligned. His materials didn't reveal a new American weapon or secret missile. They revealed something more corrosive. Pilots filing false mechanical reports to avoid sorties, commanders pressured to meet sortie quotas with aircraft everyone knew were outmatched, and internal briefings that warned about F-15 radar without offering any solution. One intercepted remark preserved in a redacted intelligence summary said continuing intercepts under those conditions meant dying without ever seeing the enemy, and that sentence, stripped of ideology, stripped of slogans, explains everything that followed. The CIA's own language was restrained, clinical, but the implication was brutal. Morale degradation among elite interceptor units tasked with national air defense. That was not supposed to happen. By 1984, Soviet responses along the northern approaches had thinned to shadows, aircraft holding distance, watching from beyond engagement range, flying missions designed not to intercept, but to avoid being seen. The Foxbat reduced from spear to spectator. At RAF Lakenheath, intelligence officers noticed the change, but struggled to place it inside the larger Cold War narrative because there was no dramatic event to point to, no wreckage, no dogfight, no diplomatic incident, just a quiet behavioral shift that didn't fit the models. Reports went upward and then vanished, not necessarily suppressed, but orphaned, because they described a victory that wasn't kinetic, and a defeat that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The Soviets never announced a doctrinal retreat. NATO never declared an advantage. And so the moment slipped between categories, too subtle for headlines, too important to ignore. But the data remains in fragments, radar plots, pilot interviews, maintenance memoirs, redacted assessments, all pointing to the same conclusion. Sometime between November 1982 and spring 1983, the balance of the air war changed without a single shot fired. Information replaced speed, detection replaced interception, and fear replaced doctrine. The MiG-25 did not fail because it was badly built or poorly flown. It failed because it was designed for a world that no longer existed, and when confronted with an enemy it could not see but knew was watching, even the fastest interceptor in the sky chose to turn away.